History of biology, take us away. Dun, dun. Ooh, I want every instrument being played on stage when I perform. Oh, this is everything I need. I need every instrument play when I perform. I need to raise money that they can bring on stage to me. Oh, history of biology.
Like other early naturalists, saw that a methodical catalog of species, arranged on some principle which could be accepted in all times and in all countries, was indispensable to the progress of natural history, and such a catalog formed an essential part of his plan. Perhaps he was a little deficient in that discernment of hidden affinities which has been the gift of great systematizers, but his industry, learning, and candor accomplished much. Quadrupeds, birds, reptiles, fishes, insects, and plants of every sort were reviewed by him. British species naturally received special attention, but Ray did not fail to make himself acquainted with the natural productions of foreign countries, partly by his own travels, and partly by comparing the descriptions of explorers. He seized every opportunity of investigating the anatomy and physiology of remarkable animals and plants, and attended to the practical uses of natural history. British naturalists owed to him the first serviceable manuals for use in the field. Ray was the first botanist who formally divided flowering plants into monocotyledons and dicotyledons. It was only natural that he should now and then have misplaced plants whose general appearance is deceptive: lily of the valley, Paris, ruscus, etc. He was perhaps the first to frame a definition of a species, but here his success, as might be expected, was not great. A species was with him a particular sort of plant or animal which exactly reproduces its peculiarities generation after generation. Any plant, for example, which comes up true from seed would, according to Ray, constitute a species. By this definition, many races of plants which are known to have been produced in nurseries would rank as true species. The scale of nature. No one can closely examine a large number of plants and animals without perceiving real or imaginary gradations among them. The gradation, shrews, monkeys, apes, man, is not very far from a real genealogical succession confirmed by structural and historical proofs. The gradation fish, whale, sheep, on the other hand, though it seemed equally plausible to early speculators, is not confirmed by structure and history. In the age of Aristotle, and for long afterwards, the ostrich was believed to be a connecting link between birds and mammals, because it possessed, in addition to obvious bird-like features, a superficial resemblance to a camel, long neck, speed in running, desert haunts, and a rather imaginary resemblance in the toes. Sedentary, ranching zoophytes were quoted as intermediate between animals and plants, corals and barnacles as intermediate between animals or plants and stones. Aristotle was convinced of the continuity of nature. His scale of being extended from inanimate objects to man, and indicated, as he thought, the effort of nature to attain perfection. Malpighi traced analogies between plants and animals, identifying the seed and the egg, as many had done before him, assuming that viviparous as well as oviparous animals proceed from eggs, and comparing the growth of metals and crystals with the growth of trees and fungi. Leibniz believed that a chain of creatures rising by insensible steps from the lowest to the highest was a philosophical necessity.
A chain of creatures rising from the philosophical stars. I'm a descendant of Genghis Khan in his prime, which was always in the still. History of biology, take me away. I'm making it rain, Benjamin. Make it rain, you know.
capacity. Buffon accepted the same conclusion and affirmed that every possible link in the chain actually exists. Pope reasoned in verse about a vast chain of being which reaches from God to man and from man to nothing. The 18th century was filled with the sound. Bonnet in 1745 traced the scale of nature with more detail than had been attempted before. He made Hydra a link between plants and animals, the snails and slugs a link between mollusca and serpents, flying fishes a link between ordinary fishes and land vertebrates, the ostrich, bat, and flying fox links between birds and animals. Man, endowed with reason, occupies the highest rank. Then we descend to the half-reasoning elephant, to birds, fishes, and insects, supposed to be guided only by instinct, and so to the shellfish, which shade through the zoophytes into plants. The plants again descend into figured stones, fossils, and crystals. Then come the metals and demi-metals, which are specialized forms of the elemental earth. Water, air, and fire, with perhaps the ether of Leibniz, are placed at the bottom of the scale. In Bonnet's hands, the scale of nature became an absurdity by being traced so far and in so much detail. It was not long before a reaction set in. The great German naturalist Pallas, in his Elenchus Zoophytorum, 1766, showed that no linear scale can represent the mutual relations of organized beings. The branching tree, he said, is the appropriate metaphor. Cuvier taught that the animal kingdom consists of 4 great divisions, which are not derived one from another, and his authority overpowered that of Lamarck, who still maintained that all animals form a single graduated scale. A complete reversal of opinion ensued, so complete that at length the theologians, who had once seen in the scale of nature a proof of the wisdom of providence, were found fighting with all their might against the insensible gradations which, according to Darwin's Origin of Species, must have formerly connected what are now perfectly distinct forms of life. The 18th century supporters of continuity in nature were not merely wrong in picturing the organized world as a simple chain or scale. They were also wrong in assuming that all the links or steps still exist. We can now see that vast numbers are irrecoverably gone. It is a safe prophecy that the filiation of species will never be grasped by the intelligence of man, except in outline, and even an outline which shall truly express the genetic relations of many chief types is unattainable at present. The sexes of flowering plants. As soon as men began to raise plants in gardens, or even earlier, they must have remarked that plants produce seeds, and that seeds develop into new plants. The Greeks, Empedocles, Aristotle, Theophrastus, recognized that the seed of the plant answers to the egg of the animal, which is substantially, though not literally, true. None of the 3 understood that a process of fertilization always, or almost always, precedes the production of seed. Had the date palm, whose sexes are separate, and which has been artificially fertilized from time immemorial, been capable of cultivation in Greece, Aristotle would not have said that plants have no sexes and do not require to be fertilized. His pupil, Theophrastus, knew only by hearsay of the male and female date palms and affirmed that both bear fruit. Pliny, 300 years later, called pollen the fertilizing substance and gave it as the opinion of the most competent observers that all plants are of 2 sexes. The revivers of botany paid no attention to pollen or the function of the flower. It is more surprising that in the following century, Malpighi, who had diligently studied the development of the plant embryo, should give so superficial an account of the stamen and its pollen. About the same time, Grew and Millington expressed their conviction that the attire, anthers, thus serve as the male for the generation of the seed. Grew's Anatomy of Plants, 1682. A few years later, Ray speaks of the masculine or prolific seed contained in the stamens. Wisdom of God, 1691. In 1691 to 1694, Camerarius, professor at Tübingen, brought forth clear experimental proof that female flowers, furnished only with pistils, produce seeds freely in the neighborhood of the male or staminate flowers, but fail to do so when isolated. he distinctly inferred that the anthers are male organs and the pistil the female organ. The claim set up on behalf of Linnaeus that he demonstrated or helped to demonstrate the sexes of flowering plants has little foundation in fact. To make out such details of the process of fertilization as the formation of pollen tubes, the penetration of the ovules, and the fusion of nuclei required the improved microscopes of the 19th century. The almost universal presence, both in plants and animals, of a process of fertilization is a fact whose physiological meaning we but imperfectly grasp. Modern research has shown that the pollen tube is exceptional and confined to the flowering plants. The motile filament of cryptogams, analogous to the spermatozoon of animals, is no doubt a relatively primitive structure, which gives one of the strongest indications of the common origin of all forms of life. End of period 2. End of section 5. Section 6 of History of Biology by L.C. Meal. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Period 3, 1741 through 1789. Characteristics of the period. The chief historical events are the decline of the French monarchy, the French Revolution, the rise of Prussia, the expansion of England, and the American Declaration of Independence. In the history of thought, we remark the introduction of the historical or comparative method, which seeks to coordinate facts and to trace events to their causes. Science steadily grows in influence, and free thought wins many triumphs. This is the age of Voltaire, Rousseau, and the encyclopedists, of David Hume, of the French economists, and Adam Smith. Systems of flowering plants. Linnaeus and the Josias. Linnaeus is remembered as a man of great industry, enterprise, and sagacity, who was inspired from boyhood by a passion for natural history and spent a long life in advancing it. He was early recognized as a leader in more than one branch of the study. Labelle, Morrison, and Ray have labored to found a natural system of flowering plants, and it was they who laid the foundation upon which all their successors have built. The work did not, however, go steadily forward on the original plan. When Linnaeus entered upon the scene, the prevalent systems were only moderately natural and far from convenient in practice. To place the undescribed
getting straight as my legacy. I live a young, rich, handsome, young, wealthy, rich lifestyle. They bad powers on me every time. They love to see me never doing crime. They love to see me never doing time. They never like to see me close down, so they keep the dog free, Free BJ, I pay Pimp say, how good is Boo say? Doing, I hope it's B-E-S-T. I hope it's best, cause he be best than all us. He told us Jay-Z was eating when he was dang near touching the deal. Now he worth $1 billion or two and he know where I live. He can send a team come drill me. That takes some effing discipline. It's for self-restraint. I'm in the motherland. Where work the bank? Where my money at? Hey, where's the bank? God dank. I got a fish tank. What that mean? I got flow. I made it rain and made the weather change. History of biology, take me away.
Species which poured in from North America and other distant countries was a difficult task, with which the universities and botanic gardens of Europe could but imperfectly cope. Linnaeus, who had the instincts of a man of business, saw that botany was falling into confusion, and that the only remedy was a quick and easy method, which could be mastered in a few days and applied with certainty. No such method, he well knew, could take into account all the intricate affinities of plants, but to devise a perfect method required the labors of generations of botanists. Meanwhile, a temporary expedient, full of faults it might be, would remove a pressing evil. Flowering plants had been arranged by the divisions of the ovary or by the petals and sepals, with no very satisfactory results. It occurred to Linnaeus to try the number of the stamens and styles. Any such method was bound to present many anomalies, associating plants which are only distantly related, and separating plants which are closely related. But some of the worst anomalies were avoided, and some well-established families, crucifers, composites, labiates, retained at the expense of symmetry. Not even the
Gotta survive with excellence, and outstandingness, and affection, and protection, and security, and great health. The best health you can have, top shelf. History of biology doing the best. For me, I'm passion, every test excellently applies. So stand in the behavior that should receive from all of us in the better. Make some noise and go now. For all of us. Be proud of me. History of biology. Take us
pressing need of simple definitions, which was allowed to spoil so natural a group as the umbellifers, by associating with them a number of alien genera, could induce Linnaeus to place ranunculus and potentilla in the same class. Linnaeus gained currency for his system by connecting it with the newly accepted doctrine of sexes in plants. That doctrine was not conceived nor demonstrated by him, and it had, as we now see, no further connection with classification by stamens and styles than it explained the almost universal occurrence of such parts in flowering plants. But Linnaeus had persuaded himself that he had done more to establish the existence of sexes in plants than anybody else, and that the physiological importance of stamens and styles was a proof of their systematic value. Neither of these beliefs can stand inquiry, but both were extremely influential on contemporary opinion. The so-called sexual system achieved an immense success everywhere but in France and Germany. Botanists of small experience were now able to say whether the plants which seemed to be new were really undescribed or not. If undescribed, what was their appropriate place in the system? The congestion of systematic botany was relieved. The great naturalist appealed to posterity by publishing the sketch of a natural system of flowering plants, which he accompanied by judicious expositions of the philosophy of classification. He had the permanent reform of systematic botany really at heart. He did not believe that his own sexual system could be final, and he was glad to help in setting up a better one. To this end, he united groups of genera into families which he did not pretend to define, being often guided only by an obscure sense of natural bonds of union. Bernard de Jussieu, one of the most patient and observant of systematists, devoted his life to the same task, and profited by the example of Linnaeus. He published nothing, but found expression for his views.
ATL to Beijing, to Detroit, to Warren, Michigan, all the way to California, coast to coast, planet to planet. Talking with your Branson. I've been knowing Holly Branson for a while. She love my style. 2 teeth missing and she still love my smile. Wait till the diamonds get on my girl, you gon' really know when you hear me stomping my feet on the ground. Sound like Sasquatch, heart beating loud, but not that loud that it's in sync with the crowd. My tempo adjusted for all of my comfort for now. Presently, I'm presenting to your heart so much for me. Young drummer Mrs. Jay-Z, that for the AUTOTUNE. Appellation and point, appellation mark. History of biology, take us away. On my sleeves, you'll see my heart begun.
The arrangement of a botanic garden at Versailles. His ideas were afterwards developed by his nephew, A.L. de Jussieu, in the Genera Plantarum, 1789. Affinity became at length the avowed basis of every botanical system. No convenience in practice, no agreement or difference in habit was knowingly permitted to override this mysterious property. What then is affinity? What are the natural groups of animals and plants, and how do they arise? Until the year 1859, no one could tell. The terse maxims of Linnaeus helped to guide naturalists into the right road, but a single fact shows how inadequate they were. Linnaeus emphatically and repeatedly declared his belief in the constancy of species. But if species were really constant, affinity between species must have been no more than a delusive metaphor. The resemblances between distinct species could not, on that supposition, be the effect of inheritance. Linnaeus's imperfect appreciation of the fundamental difference between a natural classification of living things and such classifications as man makes for his own practical ends is further revealed by his admission of a third kingdom of nature. The third kingdom of nature was taken from the alchemists. Not only animals and plants, but rocks and minerals as well had, he thought, their genera and species. The genus and species thereby become more logical terms, independent of the inheritance and of life itself. Linnaeus had a passionate love of order and clearness, enforced by an inexhaustible power of work. Hence he was able to serve his own generation with great effect, to methodize the labors of naturalists, to devise useful expedients for lightening their toil, such as his strict binomial nomenclature, and to apply scientific knowledge to the practical purposes of life. The binomial nomenclature had been gradually coming in ever since the time of
scientific knowledge, the premises of life and the universe on earth as humans. We haven't seen. We had the event stages when we had making these wages, looking really good. Could even bought up every shoe at Payless. Think the drop of crazy. Praise. God bless me.
the Bahines. But the complexity of nature is not to be suddenly and forcibly reduced to order, and much of Linnaeus's work has to be done over again in a different spirit. Cuvier furnishes a somewhat parallel case. Cuvier, too, was an indomitable worker. His power of organization moved the wonder of Napoleon, and there was no greater master of clear thought and clear expression. But like Linnaeus, Cuvier overlooked much that was already obscurely felt and clumsily worded by brooding philosophers, germs of thought which were destined to become all-powerful in the course of a generation or two. It must not be supposed that the labors of Linnaeus and Cuvier were bestowed in vain. All that was really valuable in their writings has been saved, and biology will never forget how much it owes to their lifelong exertions. Réaumur and the History of Insects. Réaumur was born to wealth and made timely use of his leisure to study the sciences and win for himself a place among natural philosophers. His inclinations directed him first towards mathematics, physics, and a little later towards the practical arts. He took a leading part in the magnificent description of French industries, which had not been undertaken by the Académie des Sciences. Not content with describing the processes in use, he perpetually labored to improve them. The manufacture of steel, tin plate, and porcelain, the hanging of carriages and the fitting of axles, the improvement of the thermometer, glass hives, and the hatching of fowls' eggs by artificial heat are among the many objects to which his attention was directed. Natural history gradually took a more and more prominent place in his studies, and a great history of insects engaged the last years of his busy life. Réaumur was neither an anatomist nor a systematist. At least he gained no distinction in either of these branches of biology. No biological laboratory had been dreamt of in his day. He lacked the manipulative skill of Swammerdam or Linné. He was no draftsman and had to engage artists to draw for him. One qualification of the first importance, however, he possessed in a high degree: the scientific mind. As he watched the acts of an insect, questions at once sagacious and practical suggested themselves in abundance, and these questions he set himself to answer in the best possible way, namely, by observation and experiment. In close attention to the activities of living things, his ingenuity and patience found a boundless sphere of exercise. Moreover, all that he had seen he could relate in a simple and picturesque manner, using the language familiar to the best French society in the generation next after Madame de Sévigné. Diffuse but clear, amusing but never frivolous, he won and kept the attention of a multitude of readers, the best of whom were incited to adopt his methods or to pursue inquiries which he had indicated. His greatest successes were won in observing and interpreting the natural contrivances of insects, the means by which they get their food and provide for their safety, their transformations, instincts, and societies.